Welcome to my art channel. I'm Evelyn, Swiss artist in love with fantasy, myths and gothic horror, and I paint in a variety of traditional media. I've been practicing portraits for a while now, and recently, instead of sketches or studies, I went all in with a painting on a linen canvas and learned so much from that process about color mixing, lighting, controlling my value ranges and stylization. So while I'm no expert on portraits, I hope that my insights and even my struggles and how I problem solve along the way can help you on your own art journey as well. I'm painting on a linen canvas, not a stretched canvas, but one mounted on a panel. This is a surprisingly simple process and saves so much space and, to be honest, money, while still giving me stability while painting. The linen I'm using has a very fine weave, which I prefer by leaps and bounds to the medium and rough cotton canvases I can find locally, and it suits smaller format paintings as the texture of the canvas doesn't stand out against details. But my sketch still had to be rougher than when I'm drawing on watercolor paper, of course. On surfaces that aren't great for erasers, I like to work in multiple different shades to build up my lines. Here I use the Derwent colored pencil to go over my rough pencil guidelines. I also use the colored pencil to sketch in cast and form shadows, kind of differentiating those from the anatomy of the portrait. Now, you might notice that I'm not going for realism here, quite far from it actually, as I mostly paint fantasy art which can range from realistic painting styles to very stylized ones. I'm more at home on the stylized end of that scale, maybe with some realistic painting qualities, but I often simplify my characters quite a lot. I hope that even if you paint in a more realistic style with softer edges and natural proportions, you can still see some of those influences in my process as well, from how I approach lighting to the underlying anatomy of it all. Using different shades for my sketch helps me think in different steps and re-evaluate my lines kind of independently from each other. The head shape is, I think, clearly once again based on the Asaro head model. That has been a huge influence on all my sketches and paintings this year, and especially for extreme lighting situations like what I have planned here. The planes of the head as presented in the model are incredibly helpful to understand. While I seal pencil drawings done on paper with gel medium, here, to preserve the canvas texture, I'll be going right to the underpainting. For that, I have my art material lineup here. A new addition is this Stay Wet palette. As I often have little time for personal projects like this, a Stay Wet palette is perfect for preserving paint whenever a painting session gets interrupted. While I like to paint with soft round brushes usually, here for the canvas, I've also brought out my favorite synthetic bristle brushes from Jackson's art, the Akoya line. As well as a long flat by Rosemary's, which is amazing for soft yet decisive paint block-ins. One day I'll get a whole bunch more of these, maybe as a birthday gift to myself. While I used some acrylic mediums later in the painting process, this underpainting was all about diluting with just water. that can get very messy if your painting surface isn't absorbent enough, but this linen canvas feels amazing to paint on. The gesso layers it came already primed with are very absorbent and don't let my paint drip all over the place. But they're also not so absorbent that I couldn't push and smear with my bristle brushes. My most used underpainting shade is the good old burnt sienna. It's not too dark, not too light, and brings a beautiful warmth to portraits especially, without overpowering whatever comes next. But at this stage it's less about the color and more about the value. I forced myself to actually cover the white of the canvas in most places, especially on her face, so that I have a mid-tone to work on top of. This overall mid-tone helps us see our values better, and as I personally often overuse my white highlights and don't embrace shadows as I'd want to, I rely on this layer to guide me in the right direction. I prefer toning my paintings like this at the underpainting stage, hinting at some detail and capturing some shapes already, bringing variety to my values, even here, instead of just toning it with one shade very evenly, though that's an approach you could take as well. This bristle brush may look ridiculously small, but it feels perfect for me. I can use it to go from spreading diluted paint to nearly line painting with heavier paint. Whenever I use larger brushes for my underpaintings, I lose a lot of control, but also find the textures created less interesting. Of course, this canvas panel is still quite small compared to what some of you might work on. Only 8 by 11 inches or 22 by 30 centimeters. So this really resilient bristle brush that can handle both details and aggressive smudging is a great fit. You could use any color for this really. I've seen amazing portrait processes using cadmium orange or even magenta for the underpainting, or on the other end of the spectrum dark earth tones like burnt umber, or even blue tones. This, in a way, is an extension of the sketching process, where before I sketched in lines, here I'm sketching in the first hints of shape. Each surface absorbs paint differently, and so for each new painting that I'm trying out new surfaces for, I also have to adjust how much I dilute my acrylic paint. And as you can see, I'm not sticking to just burnt sienna, since I already know that the background will be dark and cool toned and not hit by the same red light as Mina's face. There really was no need to go through that step. And I mixed some chromium green oxide with the burnt sienna for the left side of her hair. I also blocked in the shapes of those letters and envelopes and train schedules in the background with a dirty mix of burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, burnt umber, and again the chromium oxide green. I also used some darker colors to really capture shadows early on. The pencil drawing will, after all, disappear under my acrylic paints, so I want key areas sketched in before I lose my pencil lines. Later, when I move from transparent, diluted paint layers to more and more opaque paint, yellow ochre will become a major player, but for now, I'm all about those shadows and warm undertones. I'm not using any black paint at this stage of the painting. This is all mixes of ultramarine blue, burnt umber, and then transitioning back to the burnt sienna the closer we get to the warmly lit side of her face. This was a great moment to sit down and take another look at my values and composition. Even when I already have sketches, even when I already started a painting, it's never too late to take another look if I'm unsure about an element of my painting. Some questions might only pop up while we are working on it, after all. I needed the visual reminder to clearly separate the values of the foreground, middle ground, and background. It's a very simple composition, but still, it helps to have it sketched out and simplified again. The foreground, the portrait itself, has the largest range of values, so the greatest contrast. It's where I'll paint the darkest colors with some final highlights. But the midtones stay overall dark, as you can see here. The middle ground or mid-ground or whatever you want to call it is actually just the textile draping behind her. It's a subtle difference, but the darkest shadows there won't be as dark as the ones on the portrait itself. And then the background is our lightest area, and no element of the background will be as dark as even the mid-tones of the other two areas. I hope this separation makes sense. It of course depends on your composition, but I found that giving myself clear instructions like this is incredibly helpful. Of course, I've made my life easy by creating a background of just falling paper. Of course, those are lighter than a dark-haired character wearing a black dress. But you'll see later that even bright red wax seals in the background will be very light and muted compared to anything red and dark in the foreground. So you can make the character designs, objects, costuming and architecture in your illustrations work with your composition and value ranges, or you can make those values work with them, no matter what they are. This part here looks so scary, like I completely messed up what I'd established. Because the background and even her hair is still in the underpainting stage, with the white of the canvas blinking through here and there, her face looks like I applied foundation 2 shades too dark. But that's why I wanted to have my values clarified. It gave me the confidence to just go for this darker mid-tone immediately, as I knew it would make sense with the painting later. Much later. At this stage, burnt sienna and burnt umber got replaced by raw umber, as I really like that for these cooler shadow tones. It's time to hint at that red light hitting her face from the side. This is a quite elaborate color mix later on, but for now it's just a bit more burnt sienna layered on top of the underpainting. I had to put all personal work aside for a while and focus on some more urgent deadlines. When I finally returned to this painting, I gave myself a moment to become familiar with the color palette again. I painted some low-stakes areas, like the outer edges of those clothing folds, some of the background, just to get a feel for the color mixing again. There's a reason I like to focus on one painting at a time whenever possible. I may have multiples in the prep and sketching stage, but it's just so much simpler to have one color palette, one mood to paint in at a time. Having some low-stakes areas on your paintings that you identify very early on is also great for when you have to paint late at night. I usually use my daylight painting hours for details on the face or important color areas that need a more delicate touch, and then use the late night painting times for background elements with a simpler color scheme that I can mix even under less than ideal lighting. Let's have a look at the color palette now that we are getting closer to the final paint layers. A lot of my base colors are mixed from very simple paints. Burnt umber and ultramarine is a favorite combination, for example, to mix cool and warm grays. Then there are two paints on my palette that I don't include that often: chromium oxide green dark and cobalt green. Here you can see how both of these mix with the ultramarine. That green undertone is barely there in the painting. Can you even spot it? It's the background lighting and overall cast to everything. So there's just a little bit of these mixed in a lot of the other areas. Yellow ochre also shows up a lot, as I wanted to give Mina a warm olive skin undertone and to push beyond my usual red-blue only color palettes. So many of my paintings rely too heavily on just burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. Of course, there's one key element to this composition: the bright red spotlight. I've learned from my previous attempt. Red paints can be tricky to mix light with, as adding titanium white brings out any pink undertones they might have, and you can end up with either pink light or a salmon shade. I'm using a quinacridone red, and you can see how that leans very magenta here once diluted or mixed with white, but combined it with cadmium orange for the brighter parts of the light, and then burnt sienna to transition that mix into the skin tone again. The burnt sienna of the underpainting is still there on the portrait, as I've left that shadow area mostly untouched so far. So with how tricky red light is to mix, instead of going for brightness, I went for chroma. This is where the overall darker portrait tone and the desaturated everything is really helpful, as I hope the red will automatically stand out against that grayed down yellow ochre skin, even without adding any bright highlights. We'll see how it works out. What am I even painting here? I should probably talk about that. This is a character portrait for a series inspired by Bram Stoker's Dracula. I'd made an art scene with all my Dracula illustrations last year, a combination of ink, gouache, watercolors and acrylics to illustrate my favorite quotes and scenes from the book. Now, after time has passed, I felt the itch to dive back into the world of gothic horror and see how maybe my illustrations have evolved as well. There's a quote mentioning the red light of triumph in the book, which had been floating at the back of my mind. And so here I'm experimenting with moody colors, contrasted with an intense red spotlight. The characters in the novel are just living their lives, and then there's this intrusion of a dark force of the supernatural and horror, symbolized here with this intruding red light. The background is a nod to this being an epistolary novel. The story is told in letters, diary entries, newspaper articles and ship logs, so I turned those into these falling sheets of paper. Jonathan Harker's portrait was a huge learning experience. I'd never painted on this surface before, never with a color palette this dark for a portrait. And I learned so much from it that I can now apply here for this second portrait of Mina Harker. Jonathan was trapped inside a castle, so the background was a stone wall, and I made everything look caged in and oppressive. Mina here is under an open night sky, hinting at the later parts of the story where she helps locate Dracula through their connection. And I also wanted to give the lighting a more dreamlike quality. Acrylics can be tricky to blend and can turn out flat if we are not careful. Not saying that I've got it all figured out or anything, but I personally like to continuously change my color mix on the palette instead of trying to blend two areas together on the canvas itself by smudging with my brush. I keep the color zones of the face in mind as well, the planes of the head as seen in the Asaro model, and I avoid just laying down flat colors in large areas as it dulls down everything. So why use acrylics? Couldn't we just blend so much easier with oils? I paint in acrylics because it suits the stylized elements I want. I like my sharper edges or those hints of uneven brushwork that just happen automatically with acrylics. It's also a practicality thing for me though. I don't have a well-ventilated room, we literally eat in the same open space as I'm painting in, and a very curious cat wandering all over, so I have some concerns about using oil paints on my desk. And a lot of my commercial work can handily be thrown into the scanner immediately after I finish painting with acrylics, maybe waiting a day or two if I added any final heavy touches. Acrylic paintings are also easier to store, which is great if you have limited space. So it's part aesthetic preference, part habit, and part practicality for me. If you're going for a more natural, realistic art style, you'd probably be much better served with soft oil paint layers. But if you like sharp edges and quick drying times, join me in acrylic wonderland. I'll share some tips on how to soften your acrylics in just a bit as well. It's time for that red spotlight. The burnt sienna as the base is my guide. The red light will never be as light in value as the cool light hitting the rest of a face. It helps to visualize that, even if it's just in your mind. But what I can do is use the cadmium orange automatically being lighter than red, to hint at the areas that are hit the most directly by this spotlight, and then use the quinacridone red and burnt sienna for the rest. As the light also hits the hair, a more muted burnt sienna and burnt umber heavy mix fit better there. I try to constantly remember not only the light color, but the color of the surfaces it hits and bounces off of. Yellow ochreish skin will give that red light a different quality than the dark hair. And of course there's the eye, a more reflective surface than the skin, so we get a pure red pinpoint just there. A quick note on my canvas size. This is actually a really large portrait for me. While I work on much larger formats for illustrations in general, there the characters are usually just a small part of a scene, so faces might be tiny no matter what. In a way, this size is a challenge, where I have to explore a lot of blending techniques to make it work. You might spot some open acrylic paints. That's a paint line by Golden as well, but they dry more slowly and are more gooey fluid than their heavy body paints. I don't like to use them just on their own as they can feel slippery, but when mixing colors, I might combine my heavy body yellow ochre with an open burnt umber to make blending easier and drying times a little bit longer. The Stay Wet palette also helped with keeping my paint fresh, and as I kept on adding layers, I also used retarder fluid, which slows down drying times of the heavy body paints specifically. I usually add a tiny drop to paint mixes, but I also recently got this small bottle of open acrylic medium, which can be mixed both with open paints to make them even slower to dry and easier to blend, or with the regular acrylics to give them some of those open properties. I also have a single fluid acrylic paint by Golden, the titanium white, which also makes blending and smooth painting much easier. But really, most of it is just paint applied in multiple layers to slowly build up details. At this point, I realized that I'd overdone the rendering of Mina's hair, making it look grey and stringy, like limp seaweed or something. So here comes one of my favorite techniques that I actually get to use only rarely because of the small size I usually work on. All you need is a mop blending brush and then either diluted acrylic paints or the open acrylic paints, and together these can be used to tone down entire areas, change hues as if with a glaze, or to soften edges. Here I use the raw umber and ultramarine blue mix to deepen and unify shadows, and then immediately went in and blurred out the area with that mop brush. As the acrylic paint layers underneath don't budge at all, this can soften a painting without losing the details we worked so hard on. By the way, for some of these darkest details, I did end up using carbon black with my color mixes. I've become more confident about using pure black paint. We have to be careful when mixing it with other shades to make those darker, as it can dull our paint. But really, if I want intensity and contrast, there's nothing wrong with using an actual black. I gave these last layers a few days to dry. If you're using open acrylics, it's best to then wait even longer before varnishing. I usually give it 2 to 3 weeks, despite working in very thin layers, so your mileage might vary if you use heavier paint layers or impasto details. But they're usually touch dry within a day or two, so I could scan my portrait to make some prints, my vampiric contribution to the beginning of autumn and spooky season. The postcard size will exclusively go out to patrons, and the larger print can be found in my shop or is available with the higher tier, for which I ship with airmail every 2 months, on Patreon as well. To wrap this up, I chose a matte varnish about 3 weeks later and used that for 2 thin protective layers. I'm really happy with this portrait, but more so with the painting journey. Working in a series like this can really build up specific skills. I hope you enjoyed this painting process. Even if you maybe don't work in acrylics, I think a lot of the same skills and color mixing or value considerations can apply to all kinds of paint media. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again in my next art video.